the basic principle remains, which is that um, at some point, in a reasonably short order, U.S. military aid for Ukraine will run out. And the only way for more U.S. military aid for Ukraine would be for Trump to propose it and for Congress to vote on it. And given all the rhetoric around America first, why are we spending money on Ukraine when we have our own problems, et cetera, it's hard or perhaps almost impossible to imagine that a new military aid package for Ukraine will be approved.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
Well, we'll start off with what's happened. Donald Trump, he's finally responded to the fact that the Pentagon ordered this halt in sending air defense missiles and other weaponry to Ukraine, even though it was already in Poland. Trump said that we've been giving them weapons, we're working with them, we're trying to help them, but we haven't. And what I take from the we haven't is that we haven't completely cut off ties with them. He said that Joe Biden's administration emptied out our whole country giving them weapons, and that the US has to make sure that we have enough for ourselves. So I want to get your reaction to that and the fact that they have halted sending this aid to Ukraine in general.
Well, this is the second time that the United States has halted military aid to Ukraine since Trump became president. And the third time that the United States halted military aid to Ukraine when Trump wasn't president, he instructed Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, to block the aid package during the Biden era. So there's a pattern here, and the pattern follows a lot of pronouncements over a long period of time that Trump didn't want to continue providing military aid to Ukraine. I think it's very significant. I think it's clear. You don't have to speculate. Trump has said he doesn't want to do it. He's not doing it, and this is another sign. Now, is this the last bit of military aid that the United States is going to supply Ukraine? Probably not. There's going to be drips and drabs, but I think that we should see the writing on the wall, that Ukraine is going to have to find other ways to fight back against the Russian aggression. And that means getting more aid from other people and doing whatever they can to defend themselves with what they have.
Politico has been reporting this week, Bill, that the Pentagon's policy chief, Elbridge Colby, he blindsided people in the Trump administration, that they weren't notified that they had done this assessment, and the assessment came out that they didn't have the weaponry and the time to send it to Ukraine. Apparently, Marco Rubio wasn't even told, and John Bolton told me yesterday that he doesn't believe that Donald Trump signed off on this. So if this is the case, does Trump have control over this situation?
Well, I don't have enough inside knowledge to know who did what to who. All I can say is that there has been a very explicit stated policy by Donald Trump, by various other people in the administration, that they're frustrated with the military aid that was supplied to Ukraine. We can't forget about the whole minerals deal, where at the beginning of the minerals deal, Trump wanted to be paid back for all the military aid that had been supplied to Ukraine. And so I don't think we can sort of dance around the head of the pin and try to figure out who said what to who. I mean, it's very simple. Trump has said he doesn't want to supply military aid to Ukraine. Trump has now cut off military aid to Ukraine. And it's probably likely that as time goes on, America will no longer be a military partner for Ukraine.
So the stockpile that was meant to be sent to Ukraine this week, that, as I mentioned, was already in Poland, was kind of one of the last remaining from the Biden administration. We know that whatever aid the Biden administration has sent to Ukraine is going to run out in the coming months. And especially there was so much concern over this because Russia had publicized that they were doing this summer of offensive and that it was going to be a bombardment. And to be honest, it has. The last few months have actually been an insane amount of drone strikes and air attacks on Ukraine. So do you think we will see Donald Trump stepping up in any capacity to provide more weaponry Or is this the case where we really need to see Europe replacing and filling that void?
Well, I was told at the beginning of this year that Ukraine had enough weapons provided by the US and other allies to last until the end of the year. I don't know whether this particular move moves that up a month or two, but the basic principle remains, which is that um, at some point, in a reasonably short order, U.S. military aid for Ukraine will run out. And the only way for more U.S. military aid for Ukraine would be for Trump to propose it and for Congress to vote on it. And given all the rhetoric around America first, um, why are we spending money on Ukraine when we have our own problems, et cetera, it's hard or perhaps almost impossible to imagine um, that a new military aid package for Ukraine will be approved. And so that leaves Ukraine in a very desperate situation. We've seen this before. When Mike Johnson refused to put up for vote in the House of Representatives the military aid package for Ukraine at the beginning of 2024, Ukraine started running out of bullets. And everybody, all sorts of world leaders showed up in Washington and begged and pleaded for him to allow the vote to go forward. And eventually he did on Trump's permission. And then Ukraine was back in the game. They don't have that option right now. And so I suspect that the U.S., who's a supplier of about 40% of the military aid for Ukraine, that money will be missing. And so Europe, who doesn't have a huge amount of extra financial resources, is not going to be able to double down or increase their military aid by 60 or 70%. And so one of two things is going to happen. Either Europe will finally come to the conclusion that they need to confiscate the $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank reserves and use that money for military aid to Ukraine, or Ukraine is going to be a lot worse off. And we saw when the military aid was running out before, that it was really a desperate situation for Ukraine. And this is what Putin is banking on. He's banking on the West basically running out of steam, and that he can eventually wear us all out.
But Bill, on that note, there's reports that several European countries are exploring plans to buy American-made weapons to be able to send to Ukraine, and that would be out of their defense budgets, which we know that they can't really afford. But as you mentioned, this $300 billion number that is on the frozen Russian assets, that could be used to be buying these American-made weapons, but that would still need US government approval in order to do that. But I don't, is it such an easy process that you can go and buy US weapons even if the Trump administration is saying that they don't have the stockpile?
Well, it's not an easy process. It's a very complex process. Usually, the government is the procurer of the weapons and then supplies those weapons. But it's if the money is available, Trump is a businessman. He wants America to do more business. He wants defense companies to continue to prosper and thrive. And so there's probably some scenario in which, if Europeans are ready to pay for U.S. weapons, that those weapons will be procured. But this is definitely a huge setback for Ukraine, and not an unexpected setback. If you go back 6 months, anybody who is looking at, and this is not reading the tea leaves or speculating, this is just listening to the public statements of Trump and people around him. This is something that's been foreshadowed for a long time. And for what it's worth, Trump isn't surprising anybody with any of his policies. Everything he's done is stuff he said he was going to do, including this.
How do you think when Putin, found out that the US had paused sending these weapons to Ukraine, how do you think this is motivating him?
Well, Putin is ready to inflict enormous damage on his own country in terms of loss of soldiers and loss of money and material, knowing that we have a much lower capacity for any type of consequences. And so he's waiting us out. He's basically he's in a poker game. He doesn't have a great hand, but he can continue raising and raising and raising until we fold. And this is the first sign of us folding.
Bill, on Thursday, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, they had a phone conversation after, of course, the pause on the weapons. Trump said it was a long call. We talked about a lot of things, including Iran. We also talked about the war in Ukraine, and I'm not happy about that. No, I didn't make any progress in a peace deal. So I wonder if there was no discussion on a halt of these weapons and there was no progress on a peace deal, what exactly did these two speak about?
Who knows? I mean, it's it's always been a mystery what Putin and Trump talked about. Putin, when he wants to be, can be a very flattering, charming man, even though he's a murderous thug. If he wants to charm his interlocutors, he can do that. And I'm sure he was buttering up Trump in the best possible way he can. And I'm sure Trump was very flattered by whatever he said, because that is Putin's modus operandi.
The Kremlin responded to the pause in the weaponry. They said that the fewer arms supplied to Ukraine, the closest the end of the special military operation will be. So I wonder, that was from Dmitry Peskov, Bill, but surely that quote in itself should be an indication that there is no peaceful way to end this war.
Putin has only one objective, and he hasn't deviated from that objective since the beginning of the war, which is total victory over Ukraine. And he's not incorrect that if U.S. stops supplying weapons, then then Russia is closer to a total victory than they were when U.S. was supplying weapons, which should give the U.S. Pause, or I should say resumption to their supplying of weapons if the U.S. cared about Ukraine. But that doesn't seem to be a priority for Trump at the moment. He seems to want to end this war on terms that would be disadvantageous for Ukraine, and he's done Putin a big favor by this particular move.
Well, last month, when Ukraine carried out their Operation Spiderweb, we saw Donald Trump really praising Ukraine and its army for the way in which that 18-month operation went down and how successful it was. And I wonder, this drone attack from into Russia's air bases last month in the early June, shouldn't it indicate that with the right machinery, with the right artillery and the right weaponry, the Ukraine's army are naturally stronger, naturally more experienced than Russia's, and they are so much more determined to push back because it's obviously their country being invaded. So how should we let Ukraine keep orchestrating these attacks?
Well, there's one thing that's very interesting is that with the U.S. stepping out of the game, it means that the U.S. can't tell Ukraine what they can do and what they can't do. And one of the greatest frustrations during the Biden administration was that the Biden people told Zelenskyy, don't strike this inside of Russia. Don't use this weapon to strike that. And if the Trump administration is no longer supplying weapons, then they don't have any particular moral authority or leverage to tell the Ukrainians what to do and what not to do. And Operation Spiderweb, the destruction of about a third of the long-range bombers, was one good example of that. Another example is for the Ukrainians to strike Russia's oil infrastructure. And they were doing that very nicely for a while. There was a supposed peace deal in the making, and Trump asked them, don't strike their oil refineries. Well, if Trump is not supplying weapons, they can now start doing that again. And by the way, that's a big part of the economics that Russia still has to fund their war. And so I would expect to see the Ukrainians doing that. And furthermore, the Ukrainians are very, as you mentioned, ingenious about how to use whatever they have. Ukrainians don't have a navy, but they successfully have immobilized the Russian Navy in the Black Sea to such an extent that they're no longer, that they've sunken a bunch of ships, and the other ships are way out of the range of fire because the Russians are so afraid of losing more ships. So a country that doesn't have a navy has pretty much dominated the sea. Furthermore, you have a situation where in a normal unfair fight between a well-armed aggressor and an under-resourced victim, the aggressor would control the skies. And we're more than 3 years into this. Russia does not control the skies. Ukraine has an air defense. It's not the perfect air defense, but Russia is afraid to send their bombers into Ukrainian airspace because they'll be shot down. And so Ukraine is very good at dealing with these types of things, given their given their limited resources. But they are limited in their resources.
Well, I wonder, Bill, if it ended up being that the US really does cut ties in terms of aid, military aid, humanitarian aid, whatever it may be, to Ukraine, and Europe steps up, whether that might be buying US-made weaponry or just sending more of their own, would they have any strings attached to what they're sending Ukraine, or will it really be do what you can, do what you have to do?
Well, I'm sure that Trump likes to have leverage even where he doesn't have leverage, and so perhaps one of the conditions of Ukraine buying American weapons using European money would be some kind of strings attached. It's hard to say. Um, what we can say is that Ukraine can make a lot of their own weapons now, and I mean they're in a much different position 3.5 years into this war than they were at the beginning, and they have a drone production operation which is world class, probably the best in the world, something that the rest of us can learn from. And similarly, they're coming up with different types of defense. They have a new uniform that allows soldiers to survive various types of drone attacks. And so the Ukrainians are constantly innovating because they have to. And they're constantly making do with what resources they have, which doesn't mean that it's not terrible for Ukraine and for the soldiers and for the victims of all this stuff. But I wouldn't count out the Ukrainians, whatever happens, because they're defending their the Ukrainians are defending their territory, their freedom, and their people, and that's a highly motivating factor in how they're going to operate.
Bill, I mentioned this phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin yesterday, and then we've got Donald Trump speaking with President Zelenskyy today, which will be, I guess, 2 days after the Pentagon made the announcement that they would be pausing this weaponry being sent to Ukraine. I find this a little odd that Donald Trump would have a phone call with President Putin before President Zelenskyy. And not only odd, but quite insulting. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, we all saw what happened in the Oval Office with the president and J.D. Vance ganging up on Zelenskyy. And again, we don't have to speculate or try to figure out what Trump is thinking. He's saying it and he's doing it. He doesn't have respect for Zelenskyy. He's got immense respect for Vladimir Putin. What's behind all that is, the subject of lots of speculation, but we don't need to speculate on what's behind it. We can see it with our own eyes, and it's not a good sight. And for those people who care about Ukraine, it's pretty upsetting to see such disrespect for the hero who is holding off a violent, murderous dictator who the whole world should be. We should all be against Putin, and we should all be standing up for Zelenskyy. But that is not the position that Donald Trump is taking right now.
How do you think Zelenskyy will approach this phone call today with Donald Trump?
I think he'll use his best efforts and his charm and everything he can muster to try to convince Trump to turn the weapon supply back on. And it may be that Trump actually does. The problem is that we can see the trend here, and the trend is that Trump is going to cut off Ukraine. That's what's going to happen. And so whether it happens today, last week, next week, that's what's going to happen. And so I think everybody, including Ukraine, is preparing themselves for that. But that is the eventuality that's going to be the new reality for Ukraine.
Bill, just a final question. Earlier in this week, it was Lindsey Graham. He had his sanctions bill greenlit by Donald Trump. He said you can take it to the Senate floor for this vote. But he did indicate that a few modifications need to be made. We've been back and forth with these modifications and reports that he wants to water down this sanctions bill, which would, of course, slap any country importing Russian energy with a 500% tariff, which you and I have spoken about at great lengths, that this would severely cripple Russia's economy. So do you see this sanctions bill seeing the light of day, or do you think that this will continue to be stalled, even though there are these reports that he has greenlit it?
Well, I don't really see if he's greenlit it, then they should have voted on it already. So obviously there's something going on behind the scenes which is holding it back. And while Lindsey Graham is a great friend of Ukraine, he's also a great friend of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, for reasons that haven't been articulated, doesn't want to attack Putin. And therefore, it's unlikely, while Donald Trump is trying not to attack Putin and to keep Putin in the driver's seat, that this bill will go forward.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.